I'm 77 years old, and I'm answering a question I should have been able to answer without thinking. I'm sitting at my kitchen table alone, the kind of alone you don't notice until the house goes quiet in the afternoon and stays that way. My grandson asked me, "Grandpa, what does being a man really mean?" And he didn't ask it like a joke or like he was trying to sound grown. He asked it like he was carrying something and didn't know where to set it down. He's 14. He's tall for his age, shoulders starting to widen, voice cracking at the worst times. He still forgets his charger in my living room and then acts like it doesn't matter, and then comes back an hour later pretending he was just in the neighborhood. He's not a little boy anymore, but he isn't a man either, and you can see how uncomfortable that space is. He asked me in the car. We were stopped at a light. He had his backpack on his lap, both hands around one strap like he was holding himself in place. I could hear his breathing because the heater was off and the radio was off and there was nothing else to cover it. I didn't answer right away. That's the honest part. I didn't answer because I realized in that moment that I'd spent my whole life acting like I knew, and I didn't know in a way I could put into clean words. I knew rules. I knew habits. I knew what men were expected to do. I knew how to keep moving. But I didn't know what it meant when you stripped away everything that other people clap for. When you're my age, you live with a quiet inventory, not the kind you write down, but the kind your mind runs on its own when you're brushing your teeth or reaching for the mail. Names, dates, faces, things you meant to say, times you decided to wait, times you thought you were being strong and you were actually being absent. I said to him, "That's a big question." And he nodded like he already knew it was. And that hurt me more than the question itself, because it meant he didn't expect an easy answer, and he didn't expect comfort. He expected something true. I've had a lot of time to practice sounding confident. Men my age were trained for that. If you didn't have the answer, you acted like you did. If you were scared, you swallowed it. If you were hurt, you got busy. If someone cried, you stood there stiff and useful and called it strength. I'm not proud of that. I'm not ashamed in a dramatic way either. It's just the material my life was built out of, and it took me a long time to realize that some materials crack, no matter how careful you think you're being. When I was young, being a man meant providing. That's what my father believed, and his father before him. The men worked. The women made the home. The kids were supposed to be grateful. Love was assumed. Apologies were rare. Compliments were rarer. You didn't sit around talking about feelings because feelings didn't pay the mortgage. My father was a decent man in the way people meant it back then. He didn't drink away his paycheck. He didn't hit us. He showed up. He fixed things. He kept the car running. He put food on the table. He also didn't say much. I can count on one hand the times he told me he was proud of me, and I'm not exaggerating. When he did say it, it was like hearing a foreign language. It landed hard because it was so uncommon. He died when I was in my early 30s. Heart trouble. He'd been ignoring it for years because that's what men did. He didn't want to be the kind of man who complained, and he didn't want to be the kind of man who needed help. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't realize he was becoming one anyway by refusing to deal with what was real. At his funeral, people said what they always say: hard worker, good provider, a man of his word. I stood there in a suit that didn't fit right, and I listened, and I felt this strange emptiness because nobody talked about who he was when the work was done. I promised myself I'd do better, And then I went home and did what I always did. I went back to work. I got married young, 22. My wife, Margaret, was 20. She had dark hair and a steady way of looking at you that made you straighten your back without even realizing you were doing it. She laughed easily, but she also had a seriousness underneath it, like she knew life could turn on you without warning. We didn't have much money at first. We had a small apartment with thin walls. You could hear the neighbors argue. You could hear their television. You could hear their baby cry. Our furniture didn't match. We ate a lot of cheap food and told ourselves it was temporary. I worked days at the plant and picked up extra shifts when I could. I told myself I was building something. I told myself the extra hours were love. Margaret would make coffee in the morning and set my lunch on the counter. A sandwich, an apple, sometimes a cookie wrapped in wax paper. She'd kiss me near the door. Sometimes she'd say, "Drive safe," and I'd nod without really meeting her eyes because I was already thinking about the day ahead. When people talk about regret, they like to point to one big moment, a fight, a betrayal, a decision that ruined everything. That wasn't my life. My life was made of small choices that made sense on their own. An extra shift instead of a school play, overtime instead of a birthday dinner, next weekend instead of today, silence instead of the uncomfortable sentence that needed to be said. And I didn't see it as neglect because nothing was falling apart. The bills got paid, the kids were fed, the car started in the morning, the lawn got mowed, the house stayed standing. Men like me confuse stability with closeness. We think if nothing is breaking, everything is fine. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. When my son was born, I felt something I didn't have words for. I remember standing in the hospital room, looking at this tiny face and thinking, I have to get this right. I have to be the kind of man he can trust. Then the nurse handed him to me, and I held him like he was something fragile and borrowed, and Margaret watched me with tears in her eyes. Later, when we got home, the reality showed up. Sleepless nights, diapers, money tight again, Margaret tired in a way I had never seen before, me tired too, but in a different way, because I could leave the house and she couldn't. She would ask for help sometimes, and I would help, but I did it like a task, like I was checking something off. I didn't understand that what she needed wasn't just hands. It was me, fully present, not just useful. I didn't grow up seeing men talk to their wives like friends. I saw men talk to their wives like partners in a project. The house, the kids, the bills, it was all logistics. Margaret wanted conversation. She wanted me to sit with her after dinner and tell her what I was thinking. She wanted me to ask her what she was thinking and listen without trying to fix it. I tried sometimes, but a lot of times I was impatient. Not mean, not loud, just impatient in that quiet way that tells someone they're taking up space you don't want to give. She would say, "Can we talk?" And I would say, "About what?" Like it was an assignment. And she would shrug and say, "Nothing," because she could feel the door closing. That's how it starts, if you're wondering. Not with screaming, with the door closing. In my 40s, I got promoted. I was proud of it. I had earned it. More responsibility, more pay, more stress. I started leaving early and coming home late. I started keeping my phone on the table during dinner. I started thinking about the next day while I was still in the middle of the day I was living. Margaret would sit across from me, and she would watch me eat, and she would ask about my day, and I would give her the short version, the safe version, the version that didn't require anything from me. Sometimes she'd tell me about her day, and I'd nod, and she would stop mid-sentence because she could tell I was somewhere else. I remember one night she said, "You're here, but you're not here." And I laughed a little because I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I said something like, "I'm tired," as if that explained everything. And it did explain something. I was tired, but tired isn't a personality. Tired isn't a marriage. Tired isn't a father. I thought being a man meant enduring. It meant pushing through. It meant not needing much. It meant staying steady. What I didn't understand was that the people around me didn't want me to be unbreakable. They wanted me to be reachable. The cost built quietly. My daughter stopped telling me things. She would talk to her mother instead. I didn't notice at first because teenagers are supposed to pull away, right? That's what I told myself. But really, she had learned that I didn't have the patience for anything that wasn't practical. My son started mimicking me. He'd come home from school, go to his room, keep his thoughts to himself. Margaret would try to pull him out, and he'd shrug her off the way I shrugged her off. I watched it happen, and I felt proud in a strange way, because I thought it meant he was becoming tough. Now, looking back, it just meant he was learning how to be lonely without showing it. There were good years, too. I don't want to pretend my whole life was a tragedy. We had camping trips, we had Christmas mornings, we had small victories, we laughed at stupid movies, we sat on the porch in summer, we built a decent life. But even in the good years, there was a thin layer of distance that never went away, and I kept thinking it would resolve itself later, when work calmed down, when the kids got older, when we had more money, when we had more time. The truth is, the more time you think you have, the more careless you become with it. The moment of irreversibility didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It arrived like most real things do, quietly at first, and then all at once. Margaret got sick in her late 60s. Not the kind of sickness that drops you overnight, at least not at the beginning. It started with fatigue, then appointments, then tests, then long waits in waiting rooms with old magazines and bad coffee. I went with her when I could. I sat in those chairs. I heard the words. I asked questions in a calm voice, like I was negotiating a contract. I focused on logistics again. Who do we call? What do we do next? What's the plan? Margaret didn't need a plan from me. She needed my hand on hers. She needed me to look at her without flinching. I didn't realize how much fear lived in her until I saw it in her eyes one night when she couldn't sleep and she said very softly, "I don't want to leave you." I should have said something real. I should have said, "I'm here." I should have said, "I'm scared too." I should have said, "I love you," in a way that didn't sound like a routine phrase. Instead, I said, "You're not going anywhere," like I could make it true by declaring it. That's what men like me do when we don't know how to sit with reality. We deny it, not because we don't care, but because we can't stand the helplessness of caring. Her illness stretched over years. There were good months and bad months. There were days where she looked almost like herself, and then days where she looked smaller, like the disease was slowly taking up more room than she was. During that time, I learned how to do things I had never done. I learned how to cook more than eggs. I learned which laundry settings shrink sweaters. I learned the names of medications. I learned how to speak to nurses without pretending I wasn't scared. And I learned something else too, the hardest thing. I learned that I could have been this man earlier, and I just didn't choose to be. The day she died, the room didn't feel holy or dramatic. It felt like a room, A bed, a chair, a small table with a plastic cup, the sound of machines, a nurse moving quietly. Margaret's breathing changing in a way I couldn't ignore. I held her hand, and it felt thinner than it used to. Her skin was warm, but it wasn't the same warmth. It was a borrowed warmth. She looked at me, and she tried to speak. I leaned in, and I heard maybe half of it. What I heard was, "You did your best." And that sentence is the one that breaks me, even now, because it was merciful. It wasn't accurate, not fully. It wasn't cruel either. It was merciful, and she didn't owe me mercy. After she was gone, the house changed immediately. Not because the furniture moved, but because the air changed. You don't realize how much another person fills a space until they're not there to fill it anymore. I would wake up and reach for her out of habit, and my hand would hit empty sheets. I would walk into the kitchen and expect to see her mug. I would hear a sound outside and think it was her coming back in. People called, people visited, people brought food I didn't eat. And then, slowly, everyone went back to their lives, because that's what happens. Their lives were still moving forward. Mine felt like it had stopped. This is what is permanently lost, and I want to say it plainly, because my grandson deserves plain truth. You don't get to redo the ordinary days. You don't get to go back to the night your wife asked you to talk and you chose the television instead. You don't get to go back to the car ride where your daughter was trying to tell you something and you brushed it off because you were tired. You don't get to go back to the years when your kids still wanted you around and you treated them like noise you could outgrow. You don't get to go back to your marriage before it became a system of routines. And you don't get to go back and say, "I see you," when the person is gone. You can stand at a graveside and say it to the air. It doesn't change what happened in the living room 10 years earlier. When my grandson asked me what being a man really means, all of that rose up in me, and I realized I didn't want to hand him the same empty definition I had been handed. I don't want him to grow into a man who thinks love is only money and discipline. I don't want him to grow into a man who believes silence is strength. I don't want him to become 77 and find himself at a kitchen table talking to a chair that no longer has a person in it. So I looked at him in the car and I said slowly, "I used to think being a man meant never needing anything." He kept his eyes down. He was listening. He didn't interrupt. I said, "I used to think it meant fixing problems and paying bills and keeping your mouth shut." The light turned green and I didn't move right away. The car behind us didn't honk, but I could feel the impatience of the world. I moved forward and then I pulled into a parking lot a minute later because I realized I couldn't do this while driving. I parked. I turned off the engine. The sudden quiet made it easier to tell the truth. I said, "Being a man means you do what needs to be done. Yes. You show up. You keep your word. You don't run from responsibilities." He nodded a little, like he'd heard that part before. I said, "But if that's all you are, you'll end up with a life that looks solid from the outside and feels empty from the inside." He swallowed. I saw his throat move. That's how you know a kid is taking something seriously, when their body gives them away. I said, "Being a man means you don't use work as an excuse to be absent." I said, "It means you don't make the people who love you compete with your pride." I said, "It means you learn how to say what's true before it's too late to say it." He asked me very quietly, "Like what?" And that's when I realized he wasn't asking for philosophy. He was asking for language. So I gave him language. I said, You say, I'm sorry when you're wrong, and you don't make it about saving face. I said, you say, I love you, without treating it like a payment you make once a year. I said, you say, I'm scared when you're scared, because pretending you aren't doesn't protect anyone. I said, you say, I'm proud of you, because kids don't outgrow needing to hear it. He stared at the dashboard for a long time. Then he said, is that what you did? And that's where the question became personal, and that's where my age mattered, because a younger man might have tried to protect his image. I didn't have the energy for that anymore. I said, not enough. I said, I did some of it late. I said, I was a good provider. I said, I wasn't always a good presence. He didn't look at me, but I could feel how heavy that landed. Not because he was judging me, but because he was imagining the future, and he didn't want that future. I said, your grandma loved me anyway. I said, she carried a lot that she shouldn't have had to carry. I said, and she forgave me in ways I didn't deserve. I stopped there because I could feel my voice changing, and I didn't want to perform emotion for him. I wanted him to see that feelings can exist without turning into a show. After a while, he asked, do you miss her all the time? I said, yes, and that was enough. That's another thing men learn too late. You don't have to build a speech around the truth. Sometimes one word is honest and complete. Now I'm telling you this, whoever you are listening, because my grandson asked me a question, and I realized there are a lot of boys out there trying to become men without any clear map that isn't angry or hollow. I'm not here to give advice like I'm some expert. I'm just an old man who has watched time do what it does, and I've learned that the only parts that stay with you are the parts that involved other people. Your job title won't sit with you at night. Your reputation won't hold your hand in a hospital room. Your pride won't make the house feel less empty. What stays with you is whether you were kind when you didn't have to be, whether you told the truth when it would have been easier to hide behind toughness, whether you showed up when nobody was watching, whether you made room for the people who loved you, not just in your schedule, but in your attention. If you're young, you probably think 77 is a different species. That's fair. I used to think that too. But the distance between where you are and where I am is made of regular days, and regular days go faster than you think. I look at my grandson and I see a boy trying to figure out what kind of man he's allowed to be. I see him trying to be brave without becoming cruel. I see him trying to be strong without becoming closed. I want him to know he doesn't have to choose between being steady and being tender. He doesn't have to choose between responsibility and honesty. He doesn't have to become hard to become grown. When I hang up my coat now, there's no one to straighten my collar. When I sit down at night, there's no one to tell about the small thing that happened during the day. Those are not tragedies you notice in movies. They're the quiet costs of years lived at a distance. If I have anything left to offer, it's this simple confession. I waited too long to become the man I thought I already was. I did the work. I paid the bills. I held things together. But I delayed the conversations that would have made the holding together worth it. And once the chance is gone, it's gone in a way you can't bargain with. My grandson and I drove home after that, and he didn't ask another question. He just sat there, staring out of the window, and when we pulled into my driveway, he stayed in the car for a second. Then he said, "Thanks, Grandpa." He said it like he meant it. I watched him walk up the steps, and I noticed how young his shoulders still were, despite how tall he is. I noticed how he paused before opening the door, like he was thinking about something. Maybe he was thinking about the kind of man he wants to be. Maybe he was thinking about the kind of man he doesn't want to become. Either way, I'm glad he asked me while I'm still here to answer, because there are questions you don't get to answer from the grave, no matter how much you wish you could. I don't have a big ending for this. I'm 77. My days are fewer than they were. I feel that in my knees, in my breath, in the way silence settles earlier in the evening. I'm trying to live the remaining time in a way that doesn't add new regrets to the pile. Some days I do better, some days I don't. But I know this much with a clarity I didn't have at 40. Being a man isn't proving you're tough. It's being someone the people you love can actually reach. And if you have someone in your life you can still reach, or who can still reach you, don't make the mistake of assuming you'll get around to it later. Later is a word that gets smaller every year, until one day it disappears entirely, and all you're left with is what you already did and what you didn't.